The Last Slice, unassuming pizza shop on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't much to look at, just a faded red awning with the words Tony's Pies, barely legible above the glass door. For years it went unnoticed, a forgotten relic overshadowed by chain restaurants and modern cafes. But then, something changed. The first whispers came from a man named Greg, a local mechanic who had always been indifferent to food. One day, Greg casually mentioned that he'd tried a slice of pizza from Tony's and that it was, without question, the best thing he had ever eaten. A few others in the neighborhood shrugged and decided to give it a try. Soon, word spread like wildfire. It wasn't just good pizza, it was transcendent. People would take a bite and feel a wave of euphoria, like the warmth of a crackling fire on a cold night, but deeper, more primal. The shop quickly went from deserted to packed. The owner, Tony, was a quiet man in his late 50s with a perpetually grease-streaked apron and a tired smile. He refused to divulge his secret recipe, brushing off questions with a chuckle and a vague mention of family traditions. The pizza dough was perfectly crisp. The cheese melted in a way that defied physics, and the sauce. It had a depth of flavor that was almost haunting. But the real star was the meat. Thinly sliced and impossibly tender, it carried an otherworldly richness. People swore they could taste a hint of spice they couldn't quite place, an unfamiliar but intoxicating flavor that lingered on their tongues long after they'd finished eating. It wasn't long before the obsession began. Customers came back, not just once or twice a week, but daily. Some even showed up multiple times a day, their hands trembling slightly as they handed over cash and begged Tony to make it quick. People started to change. A woman named Clara, who had always been cheerful and talkative, stopped showing up to her book club, spending all her free time at the shop instead. Another man, David, quit his job entirely, saying he didn't need much, as long as he could have the pizza. His wife left him 2 weeks later. Nobody blamed her. The shop extended its hours to meet the demand, but it was never enough. People began to fight over the last slices, their voices rising to desperate screams. Tony eventually set a strict policy: 1 pizza per customer, per visit. That's when the thefts began. Cars were broken into, cash stolen, anything to scrape together enough money for another bite. One night, someone broke into Tony's shop after hours, smashing the glass door and ransacking the kitchen. When the police arrived, they found the thief curled up on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. He hadn't taken money or equipment, just a half-eaten slice he'd found in the trash. The neighborhood fell into chaos. Friends turned on each other, families fractured. Even those who had once been strong-willed and skeptical eventually succumbed. The pizza became their sole focus, their reason for existing. And Tony? He just kept smiling that same tired smile, his apron growing dirtier with each passing day. Then came the rumors. Someone claimed to have seen Tony late at night, unloading crates from a plain white van. Another swore they'd heard strange noises coming from the basement, sounds that didn't belong in a pizza shop. One man, a former butcher, insisted the meat didn't taste like anything he'd ever encountered. He tried to rally the others, to warn them, but his words fell on deaf ears. Within a week, he was seen standing in line at the shop, his face hollow and resigned. Eventually, the disappearances began. First, it was a young man named Alex, who worked at the gas station down the road. Then, an elderly woman who lived alone at the end of the street. People whispered, but no one dared to confront Tony. After all, the pizza was too good to risk losing. The police showed up once, investigating the missing persons, but they left after ordering a large pepperoni for the station. One night, Clara, one of the earliest and most devoted customers, decided to stay late, waiting until the shop closed. She claimed she just wanted to thank Tony for changing her life. But as the last customer left and Tony locked the door, Clara slipped into the shadows and waited. Hours passed. At around 2 a.m., she saw him emerge from the back, dragging a large, black garbage bag toward the basement door. It didn't look like garbage. It was too heavy, too solid. Clara's heart pounded as she followed him, staying silent as he disappeared into the basement. She crept to the door and peered through the crack. What she saw made her gag. The walls were lined with hooks, and from those hooks hung slabs of meat, large, unidentifiable hunks of flesh that gleamed under the fluorescent light. In the corner, a long metal table was stained dark with blood. And there, on the table, was Alex, or what was left of him. His body had been butchered, his limbs removed with surgical precision. Tony was humming to himself as he worked, carefully slicing pieces of meat and placing them into vacuum-sealed bags. Clara stumbled backward, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a scream, but she wasn't careful enough. Tony looked up, his tired smile replaced by something colder, sharper. The next morning, the shop opened as usual, the scent of fresh pizza wafting through the air. The line stretched around the block, filled with people who looked pale and hollow but still somehow desperate. Clara was nowhere to be found. No one questioned her absence. After all, nothing, not even the unsettling whispers or the growing unease in their stomachs, could keep them away from the last slice. The powder, in a quiet suburban community, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift that no one noticed until it was too late. Mothers would gather at the local park, their strollers parked in neat rows, their chatter blending with the laughter of toddlers on swings. It was there during one of these morning meetups that Megan first mentioned the formula. "Have you tried it yet?" she asked, holding up a canister of powder. "Luna's been sleeping through the night since I switched." The others leaned in, intrigued. Sleep was a rare commodity for new parents, and the promise of a full night's rest was irresistible. Megan handed out small scoops to a few friends, like a modern-day pusher of dreams. By the following week, the formula had become the talk of the neighborhood. Word spread quickly. This wasn't just any formula. Babies who had been fussy and inconsolable were suddenly calm. Colicky infants who had kept their parents up for weeks now cooed contentedly in their cribs. It was miraculous, or at least it seemed that way. Mothers exchanged knowing glances as they loaded their carts with canisters at the supermarket, their hands shaking slightly with anticipation. Some claimed their babies were hitting milestones faster, rolling over, sitting up, even babbling with an unusual clarity for their age. "It's like they're smarter," one mother whispered at a playdate, like the formula is helping their brains develop faster. But then, subtle oddities began to emerge. Jenny, a first-time mom, noticed her son, Max, staring at her for long stretches, his gaze unnervingly focused for a 6-month-old. "It's like he's studying me," she joked to her husband, who brushed it off. Another mother, Elena, swore her daughter Lily mimicked her laugh one day, not in the usual playful way babies mimic sounds, but perfectly, as if she had recorded it and played it back. The mothers chalked it up to coincidence, marveling at their children's precociousness, but a faint unease settled in the back of their minds. Then came the dreams. Megan was the first to mention them, her voice trembling as she confided in her closest friend. "It's the same every night," she whispered. "I'm in a dark room and there's something there. I can't see it, but I can feel it watching me. And then I hear Luna crying, but it's not normal crying. It's like she's calling for me, like she knows something." Her friend laughed nervously, brushing it off as exhaustion, but deep down, she knew exactly what Megan meant. The dreams were spreading, creeping into the sleep of every parent who had given their child the formula. The dark room, the unseen presence, the cry that was more than just a cry, it was always the same. It wasn't long before the babies began to change. At first it was subtle, a strange stillness when they were placed in their cribs, their eyes unblinking as they stared at the ceiling. Then came the movements. Parents reported their children crawling earlier than expected, moving with an unsettling precision, almost as if they weren't learning but remembering how to do it. Some babies began to avoid eye contact altogether, their once bright gazes now distant and cold. One mother, in a moment of desperation, recorded her daughter in the middle of the night. When she played back the footage, her heart stopped. The baby wasn't sleeping. She was sitting upright in her crib, staring directly into the camera lens, her tiny face blank and devoid of emotion. The pediatricians were no help. "It's probably just a phase," they said, or "babies develop at their own pace." But the parents knew better. Something was deeply, profoundly wrong. A few tried to switch formulas, but their children refused to drink anything else. One father, desperate to wean his son off the powder, resorted to mixing it with regular formula. His son screamed for hours, his tiny fists pounding against the high chair tray, his face turning a deep shade of red until the father relented and gave him what he wanted. The screaming stopped immediately. The boy's face broke into a smile, but there was something in his expression, something too knowing, too sharp for a baby. The breaking point came when Megan disappeared. One morning, her husband woke to find the crib empty and the front door ajar. Megan's car was still in the driveway, her phone on the nightstand. The police were called, but they found no trace of her. Her friends gathered at her house, exchanging fearful glances. She was acting strange, one of them admitted. Last week, she said Luna had started whispering at night. Not words, exactly, but sounds, like she was trying to say something. Days turned into weeks, and Megan was never found. Her husband, hollow-eyed and frantic, moved out of the neighborhood, taking Luna with him, but the whispers didn't stop. Some parents claimed to hear faint murmurs coming from their baby monitors, like distant voices speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Others swore they saw shadows moving in their homes at night, darting just out of sight. The formula disappeared from store shelves without explanation, leaving parents scrambling to stockpile what they could find. Years later, those children grew up, seemingly normal on the surface, but there was always something off about them. An unsettling intensity in their eyes, a strange way of speaking that seemed too measured, too deliberate. Their parents never spoke of what had happened, but they carried the weight of it in their tired, haunted expressions. No one dared to question where the formula had come from or why it had been pulled from the market so suddenly. And yet, sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the empty streets, the parents would wake from the same dream. The dark room, the unseen presence, and the faint, echoing cry of a baby calling for them. They would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the memory of those days clawing at the edges of their sanity. Because deep down, they knew that whatever had been in that powder hadn't left. It was still there, somewhere, watching and waiting. And it wasn't finished. The last dish, nowhere. A cheery announcement from HR about an upcoming potluck dinner. Mandatory attendance, it read, in bold letters. It struck Amanda as odd. Company potlucks had always been casual, voluntary affairs in the past. Just an excuse to chat with coworkers and break up the monotony of the week. But this one felt different. The tone was strangely insistent, almost urgent, and the timing, late January, well after the holidays, was unusual. Still, no one questioned it. The memo even specified that everyone had to bring a dish. Something homemade, it said. We encourage a personal touch. Amanda tried to dismiss her unease as she scrolled through the thread of replies from coworkers, each one confirming their attendance with cheerful enthusiasm. On the day of the potluck, Amanda brought a tray of lasagna, a recipe she'd made dozens of times. She'd spent the evening before meticulously preparing it, layering the noodles, sauce, and cheese with care. By the time she arrived at the office conference room that evening, it was filled with the aroma of home-cooked meals. The long table at the center of the room was already laden with food. Casseroles, salads, desserts, all impeccably presented. It was strange, though. Amanda couldn't quite place why, but something about the dishes felt off. The colors were too vibrant, the textures too perfect, like something out of a magazine. Her colleagues were gathered in clusters, laughing and chatting as if it were any other company event, but there was an underlying tension in the air, an edge that no one was acknowledging. Amanda placed her lasagna on the table and grabbed a plate, moving through the line. The food was incredible, better than anything she'd ever had at a potluck before. Every dish was bursting with flavor, the kind that lingered on the tongue and made her crave more. She noticed her coworkers were eating ravenously, going back for seconds and thirds with glazed expressions, as if they couldn't stop. It wasn't long before Amanda began to feel the same pull. The roasted vegetables tasted like the essence of a summer garden. The chocolate cake was impossibly rich. The the kind that melts in your mouth. She found herself eating faster, ignoring the growing unease gnawing at the back of her mind. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Laughter turned to quiet murmurs, and the cheerful energy dimmed. Amanda noticed people staring at their plates with strange, vacant expressions. A few were trembling, their hands shaking as they reached for more food. One of her co-workers, Brian, stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. His face was pale and slick with sweat, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something. "I don't feel right," he muttered, and then he collapsed. The room went silent. Amanda froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. No one moved to help Brian. Instead, they all stared at him, their faces blank, their eyes dull. Slowly, as if compelled by an unseen force, they turned back to their plates and resumed eating. Amanda wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She realized her hands were still gripping her fork and knife, her plate almost empty. Her stomach churned, but the hunger gnawed at her, relentless and overwhelming. She felt like she was starving, even as the food sat heavily in her stomach. She looked down at her plate and saw something that made her blood run cold. A strand of hair, unmistakably human, was tangled in the sauce. Her hand flew to her mouth as she fought back nausea. She scanned the table, her eyes darting to the dishes, the serving spoons, the trays. Something clicked in her mind, a horrible realization that she couldn't unsee. The meat in the stew had an odd texture, the kind she'd never encountered before. The pork in the dumplings was faintly pink, almost raw. And the lasagna, her lasagna, was nearly untouched. A wave of dread washed over her as she stared at her co-workers, who were now eating in silence, their movements mechanical and unsettling. The room felt oppressive, the air thick with something she couldn't name. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled, and she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. That's when she noticed the HR manager, Linda, standing near the door. Linda wasn't eating. She was watching, her expression cold and impassive, her hands clasped in front of her. Her eyes met Amanda's, and for a moment, Amanda thought she saw a flicker of pity, or was it satisfaction, cross Linda's face. Amanda forced herself to move, stumbling toward the exit. No one tried to stop her. They didn't even look up. She pushed past Linda, who simply stepped aside, her lips curling into a faint, unreadable smile. Amanda didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for air in the freezing night. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The operator's calm voice on the other end only heightened her panic. She tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in a frantic jumble. "Please," she begged. "You have to send someone. There's something wrong with them. With the food." The operator assured her help was on the way, but Amanda didn't wait. She climbed into her car and sped home, the taste of the food still lingering on her tongue, sickly sweet and cloying. She spent the night vomiting, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Who had made the food? Where had it come from? And why had no one else seemed to notice? The next morning she called out of work, too shaken to face her co-workers. But when she finally worked up the courage to return 2 days later, the office was empty. Desks were abandoned, computers still on, as if everyone had left in a hurry. The conference room was locked, and no one answered when she knocked. HR didn't respond to her emails, and the company phone line went straight to voicemail. It was as if the entire office had vanished overnight. Weeks passed, and Amanda tried to move on, but the memories of that night clung to her like a shadow. She couldn't shake the image of her co-workers, their blank faces and trembling hands. The taste of the food haunted her, a phantom flavor that no amount of water or mouthwash could erase. One night, as she was scrolling through her phone, she received an email. It was from the company. "Thank you for attending the potluck," it read. "We hope you enjoyed your meal. Don't worry, we'll see you again soon." There was no signature, no contact information, just a single attachment, a photo of the conference room, the table still set, the food untouched, except for her lasagna. It was the only dish that had been cleared completely.